In order to save his life, he fled alone and entered the gate of his city like a mongoose. I impaled his foremost men alive while making his land watch. For 45 days, I set up my camp around his city and confined him like a bird in a cage. I cut down his plantations and orchards, which were without number. I did not leave a single one. I surrounded and captured the city of Hadara, the ancestral home of Retzin of the land of Damascus, the place where he was born. I carried off 800 people, with their possessions, their oxen, their sheep and goats. I carried off 750 captives from the cities of Kusara and Samaya, as well as 550 captives from the city of Mituna. Like Tel's after the deluge, I destroyed 591 cities of 16 districts of the land of Damascus. Tiglath-Pileser III. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Conquest podcast. Episode 5.5, Tiglath-Pileser III, Part 2. Last episode, we covered the Neo-Assyrian Empire from the death of Shalmaneser III, our second great Assyrian conqueror, to the first part of the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, whom, despite being a usurper, was able to first re-establish royal authority over the core territories before extending it, mainly through a series of reforms and, of course, warfare, to most of the territories controlled by the empire under Shalmaneser III. Before we continue with his conquest, I wanted to cover the main reforms and policies of Tiglath-Pileser III that allowed him to first consolidate his rule and then facilitated his great conquests. I'll start by saying that the sources that cover the reforms of Tiglath-Pileser III are scarce. However, far more sources have survived that cover the reign and policies of Sargon II, who was either his son or a usurper on his own, with the usurped being this time Tiglath-Pileser's son and heir, and these provide us with information about the political and administrative policies during the latter's reign. Today, most scholars believe that much of these policies actually originated in Tiglath-Pileser's monumental reign, and were simply continued or expanded upon by Sargon II, with the credit for them claimed by him in order to bolster his legitimacy. The first and foremost threat that Tiglath-Pileser had to face at the beginning of his reign, especially as a usurper, was the increase in the influence of provincial governors and military commanders, at the expense of the royal authority, which had declined dramatically. Upon emerging triumphant from his rebellion, the first thing he would have done was to take advantage of the situation of uncertainty to consolidate his power by purging Assyria from any rival or threat. This included the former royal family, whose remaining members were murdered. And as I explained in the previous episode, Tiglath-Pileser was probably part of the extended royal house, something which would have bolstered his claim and legitimacy. A new class of scribes, civil administrators, and eunuchs, whose loyalty was owed solely to the new regime, was established and promoted. And indeed, within only 6 months, Assyria itself was firmly under his control, something that presented any potential rival from the outer provinces with a new reality. Mighty Assyria, with its albeit diminished but still formidable resources, was now unified under the control of a new strong, ruthless, and obviously capable king, not the pushovers they had grown accustomed to. If they were to ignore him, or worse, declare independence and resist, they knew that they had better not lose, because otherwise they would probably meet a gruesome end. And despite the almost 50 years of turmoil in Assyria, it seems that none had the resources to challenge a unified Assyria, nor were they able to form a unified front against it. And so, all of the provinces east of the Euphrates were quickly brought back into the fold. And as said in the previous episode, after only these 6 months, Tiglath-Pileser had already launched his first campaign against Babylon. In a swift campaign, Babylon was conquered, its independence ended, and its troublesome populations, especially Chaldeans and Arameans, were deported. The position of king remained, but he was to be a vassal of the empire and answerable to a eunuch appointed as governor by Tiglath-Pileser. Another policy of the king was to divide the provinces into smaller and smaller ones, each to be governed by its own governor, with the aim of decreasing the resources available for each governor. These governors would in turn be constantly supervised by the king and his court. This division occurred across many years to prevent outright rebellions and stabilize new provinces. The king also reorganized the empire's administrative structure, with old positions being either abolished or stripped of much of their powers, while new positions were created to be manned primarily by either eunuchs or civil administrators. The office of Tartano, for example, had increased in power so much that by the time of Shamshi Ilu, his power rivaled that of the king himself. After Tiglath-Pileser's reforms, while it remained a powerful position, it was stripped of all military functions, which were in turn transferred to a eunuch who would, from now on, command the army in the absence of the king. Tiglath-Pileser was also active on the religious front. Remember, the king of Assyria was the high priest of the mighty god Ashur, and as such was the most senior religious figure. During Tiglath-Pileser's reign, the relative tolerance of the Assyrians towards other gods diminished. After a great city was taken, Tiglath-Pileser would order the statue of the city's god taken out of the temple to Assyria. In its stead, a statue of the god Ashur would be placed, signifying that the defeated city wasn't only defeated on the battlefield, but that its god was defeated by Ashur as well. Perhaps the most important element of the empire to be reformed was, of course, the army. Because, well, let's face it, all these reforms were nice and all, but the Assyrian Empire and society were still first and foremost militaristic ones, and for his reforms to work, Tiglath-Pileser needed to be both a capable military commander and lead a strong and loyal army. During the years of turmoil, the Assyrian army had declined, its reserves were depleted, and even its loyalty to the king called into question. Hell, some governors and commanders went so far as to command their own armies. Like any Assyrian of rank, Tiglath-Pileser probably had military experience of his own and was aware of these issues. The first and most significant reform of the army that Tiglath-Pileser enacted was to end the levy-based army. From now on, the Assyrian army was to be composed of full-time professional soldiers, to be paid for by the state. Previous armies, both Assyrian and non-Assyrian ones, did have a core of full-time professional soldiers who formed the king's bodyguard or served as officers and generals. Now, the first ever fully professional army, whose soldiers were committed to one profession only, that of warfare, and was able to campaign year-round, was born. The second reform was to open the ranks of the Assyrian army to wide-scale recruitment of non-Assyrians. While there is no doubt that non-Assyrian units existed before, it seems that there was a policy of maintaining an Assyrian majority in the army. With this act, however, the Assyrian army and its manpool greatly expanded, while bringing many peoples, who now willingly served the empire, into the fold. I will mention that despite this act, the elite cavalry and chariot units, as well as most of the heavy infantry, and of course, the officer corps, were still mainly comprised of Assyrians. Third, the cavalry and chariot element of the army was greatly expanded, highlighting Tiglath-Pileser's awareness of the importance and superiority of the cavalry. It also highlights the king's farsightedness, as he would have known that any future conflict with the cavalry-based Urartian army would require his army to field an equally formidable cavalry of its own. The last, and perhaps most revolutionary reform I'll cover, is the formal adoption of Aramaic as the official language of the empire. Although this adoption happened later on in his reign, after Assyria's dominance of Aramaic Assyria was reestablished, it was still a major step taken by Tiglath-Pileser towards establishing a uniform administration of the entire empire. There is no clear reason as to why Aramaic, the language of a conquered people, came to be adopted by Tiglath-Pileser. The only possible explanation I could find was that the Aramaic alphabet, which was derived from the Phoenician one, was seen by the Assyrians as a far easier one to write or impose than the cuneiform-based Assyrian. Also, Aramaic and Assyrian came from the same linguistic family, and after centuries of interaction, would have influenced one another. With this reform, any governor, scribe, or military commander, Assyrian or non-Assyrian, from the Zagros Mountains in the east to the Mediterranean in the west, and from Lake Van in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south, was obliged to learn, document, and report in one language. Okay, enough with reforms, and back to Conquest. Last episode, we left off in 737 BC with Tiglath-Pileser firmly established as the king of reinvigorated Assyria, having defeated an Urartu that was at the peak of its power and reclaimed most of the empire under the reign of Shalmaneser III. If anyone, especially Urartu, thought that the mighty king would settle for a mere restoration, well, they were wrong. 737 BC saw the king campaign in the east against the Medes. Assyrian forces have been operating there for some years, but now the king came in person to take command of their final subjugation. The Medes were utterly defeated, their fortresses and strong places razed or burned, massive tribute and loot extracted, and tens of thousands of people either enslaved or deported. In what is described in the annals of the king himself as a ruthless campaign, Tiglath-Pileser wanted to ensure that, similar to the southern and western fronts, the eastern front would remain quiet when he would launch his great campaign against Urartu. In 736 BC, the first step towards the long-anticipated northern campaign was taken. Tiglath-Pileser campaigned again in the regions of Uluba and Kilhi, that stood as the last buffer between Assyria and Urartu. Unlike his campaign of 739 BC, this time there was nothing to distract the king, and these regions were quickly subdued and annexed. With all buffer states gone, and all of Sarduri's allies defeated, the time now came for the great confrontation between the two greatest powers of the Near East. Although weakened militarily and economically, Urartu was still a formidable enemy, while Assyria, under Tiglath-Pileser's reign, had recovered its confidence and rebuilt its armies. Unfortunately for us, the surviving annals don't provide us with too much details regarding this campaign. Tiglath-Pileser's sights were set on Sarduri's capital of Tushpa, which had been made the capital of the kingdom during the reign of Sarduri I, after the sack of Arsashkun by Shalmaneser III. It was probably chosen due to its favorable defensive position, with a formidable citadel that lay on a steep hill overlooking the city, as well as its closeness to Lake Van, which made it easy to supply. The route chosen by Tiglath-Pileser for the invasion of Urartu in 735 BC was similar to that taken by Shalmaneser III on his return to Assyria, marching counterclockwise from the northeast of his empire and coming upon Tushpa from the east. You can see all this on the map I've posted on Facebook and Instagram. This strategy seems to have caught Sarduri II off guard and allowed the Assyrian army to bypass the difficult terrain of the Armenian highlands. These, combined with what was no doubt a great army that probably outnumbered any force that the Urartians could muster, resulted in Sarduri II choosing to avoid an open battle, and he retreated to Tushpa's great citadel. That's right, in a very unclimactic way, no final showdown between Tiglath-Pileser and Sarduri is recorded to have occurred. The citadel eventually held out, being too formidable for the Assyrians to take, nor were they able to find enough wood to build ships to cut the supplies coming through Lake Van. The rest of the kingdom, however, wasn't that lucky. With Sarduri besieged in his citadel, his kingdom was left defenseless. The Assyrian army destroyed any Urartian force it could find, while plundering and burning every village and city on its path. Tens of thousands of Urartians were either captured or massacred. It is recorded that when the Assyrians finally departed, all that remained was a trail of fire and ash. With this great victory, Urartian power was destroyed. Massive amounts of booty were taken and dedicated by Tiglath-Pileser to the god Ashur, while the tens of thousands of captives were either put to work or resettled across the empire. Much territory was also added to the empire, with its borders pushed north, beyond the Taurus and Anti-Taurus mountains. For the remainder of Tiglath-Pileser's reign and beyond, not a single threat from the north is recorded. Despite this great victory, Tiglath-Pileser wasn't going to simply kick back on his throne and slow the pace. To the contrary, he knew that now Assyria stood as the sole great power, and that the rest of the Near East now lay there for the taking. As soon as he finished celebrating his victory over Urartu, as well as performing the required sacrifices, Tiglath-Pileser was back to campaigning. The king next headed west, with the aim of both strengthening Assyrian influence and control there, and to continue the expansion of the empire on that front. After his campaign in 740 BC, the main independent states remaining in that region were the Aramean state of Damascus and the kingdoms of Israel and Judea. and while the states of that region did send tribute, the king's mind was now set on achieving absolute Assyrian hegemony that stretched from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean. However, it seems that from the dawn of history, no ruler could afford to be seen as waging war simply for the fun of it. That would be immoral. No, Tiglath-Pileser needed a just cause, i.e., a good excuse, to invade. His just cause came in 734 BC, when emissaries from Ahaz, king of Judea, and his vassal arrived bearing tribute and asking for the king's assistance against the kingdoms of Israel and Damascus. At this point, we finally have another non-Assyrian source, the Bible. The Book of Kings, part of the second section of the Bible, Nevi'im, or prophets, covers the Assyrian campaign from the point of view of the Jewish kingdom of Judea. This allows us to compare the events as described there with the annals of Tiglath-Pileser, providing us with far more certainty. This also gives us far more details about the following campaign in terms of locations, as well as the strategy and tactics of the Assyrians. The kingdom of Israel at that time was ruled by a man called Pekah, who had just recently usurped the throne of the kingdom, while Damascus was ruled by a man called Retzin. These two had formed an alliance and besieged Ahaz in Jerusalem, hoping to force him to join them in forming a unified front against the Assyrians. As told in the Bible, the prophet Isaiah counsels Ahaz to trust in God rather than foreign allies, and tells him to ask for a sign to confirm that this is a true prophecy. Ahaz refuses, saying that he will not test God. Isaiah replies that Ahaz will have a sign whether he asks for it or not, and the sign will be the birth of a child, and the child's mother will call it Emmanuel, or Immanuel, meaning God is with us. Ahaz then proceeds to send his emissaries to the king of Assyria, whose name was Tiglath-Pileser. Tiglath-Pileser jumped at the chance to intervene. Here were three vassal kings of his squabbling amongst themselves, with two of them allying with one another in order to resist him. As their overlord, it was his responsibility, nay his duty even, to intervene. In 734 BC, the king set out from northern Syria to a 3-year-long campaign. Unfortunately, we don't have information regarding the size of the Assyrian army, but given Tiglath-Pileser's reforms and the recovery of the empire, it was probably north of 50,000 men, a huge figure for that time. He didn't march south towards Damascus or Israel, as one would expect, but rather east towards Phoenicia. His plan was to conquer the entire East Mediterranean coast, thus surrounding Israel and Damascus, and cutting them off from any assistance. Phoenicia was conquered swiftly, with Sidon and Tyre being sacked by the Assyrian army. The king then continued his march south, conquering the entire Mediterranean coast as far south as Gaza, whose ruler Hanu fled to Egypt. The Egyptians were aware of the power of Assyria for centuries, and had probably already sent emissaries to the court of Tiglath-Pileser. Now, however, they suddenly shared borders with the greatest power of the Near East, whose ruler seems to have wanted to conquer the whole world. For now, however, Tiglath-Pileser wasn't interested in Egypt, as there were still many lands far closer to home for him to conquer. Before continuing his campaign, governors were appointed to the newly conquered areas, as they were made into provinces of the empire. Tiglath-Pileser next marched north to deal with Pekah and Israel. The campaign against the kingdom of Israel is described in 2 Kings 15, verse 29. Quote, Tiglath-Pileser took Ijun, Abel Beth Ma'aka, Yanuh, Kadesh, and Hatzor. He took Gil'ad and Galil, that is, Galilee, including all the lands of Naphtali, and deported the people to Assyria. These actions were also recorded by Tiglath-Pileser in his inscriptions. For some reason, no assistance from Damascus is described in any of our sources. Perhaps Retzin knew what was coming and thought it better to prepare his kingdom's defenses. Following the string of defeats, Pekah was assassinated by Husha ben Elah, a captain of his army and leader of the pro-Assyrian party in Israel. He was rewarded for this act by Tiglath-Pileser, who made him king of a now dwindled Israel. As a tributary king, he was also forced to pay a tribute of 10 talents of gold and 1,000 talents of silver. Fun fact, Husha ben Elah would prove to be the last king of the northern kingdom of Israel. For the remainder of Tiglath-Pileser's reign, he remained a loyal vassal of Assyria. He would go on to outlive Tiglath-Pileser, however, and attempt to restore his kingdom's independence during the reign of Shalmaneser V, an act which would lead to the destruction of his kingdom and the famous exile of the 10 tribes of Israel. Now only Damascus remained. Tiglath-Pileser would have no doubt known about the history of bitter rivalry between the two states, and how his great predecessor, Shalmaneser III, despite defeating Damascus in battle, failed to take the great Aramean city. To a great conqueror, this only adds to the thrill, that desire to surpass his predecessors, and the greater they were, the better. This following conflict, however, proved to be rather one-sided. The Assyrian army by far surpassed any force that Damascus could field, and Retsin wasn't of the same caliber as a leader as Hadad-Ezer had been. The Damascenes, however, put up stiff resistance, and in response, Tiglath-Pileser waged a brutal campaign against them, with all its territory ravaged, as described in the quote I've chosen for this episode. This resistance is evident in the fact that in his first attempt in 732 BC to take the city, even the great Tiglath-Pileser failed. His second attempt, however, later that year, succeeded, and finally, the great city of Damascus fell to Assyria. If anyone thought that this final victory would soothe the Assyrians, well, you haven't been listening. Retsin was killed, probably in the fighting, which, if you ask me, is far better than being taken to Assyria and being publicly flayed alive. The residents of Damascus, that is, those who survived the war and the 2 sieges, were all rounded up and deported to the land of Kir. The lands of the state of Damascus were reorganized into Assyrian provinces to be governed by Assyrian-appointed governors. By the way, we don't really know where this land of Kir is located. From the sources I've found, the only definite thing I can say about it is that it lay east of the Euphrates, which is at least 400 kilometers from Damascus. So yeah, far from home. Tiglath-Pileser followed up on his victory by marching east against an Arab queen called Shamshi. She was the successor of another queen called Zabibe, who was made vassal by Tiglath-Pileser during his first Syrian campaign. Shamshi had supported Retsin in his rebellion, hoping perhaps to gain independence from Assyria. Her forces were defeated, and more than 9,400 of her soldiers are recorded being killed. In his inscriptions, Tiglath-Pileser describes the taking of many prisoners, as well as 30,000 camels, more than 20,000 oxen, 5,000 bags of spices, and many weapons as booty. The queen herself, in the words of the Assyrians, fled after the defeat like, and I quote, "wild she-ass of the desert." However, she was soon captured and brought as prisoner to Tiglath-Pileser. Remarkably, her fate was different than that of Retsin, or almost any other enemy of the Assyrians for that matter. She was allowed to keep her throne and kingdom, along with a small force of some thousands. After her defeat, many other tribal kings and leaders came offering homage to the great king. They were made to pay tribute, as well as guard and maintain the desert trade routes, especially the incense trade. Now, only one campaign remained, a campaign that ended with not only conquest and temporal power, but also with a title that no previous Assyrian king claimed for himself, King of Babylon. That title made Tiglath-Pileser not only the viceroy of Ashur, but also of Marduk. Tiglath-Pileser may have had this ambition from the very start, and may have wanted to claim that title back in 745 BC. But as I've said many times, Babylon was different. Simple military might wasn't enough for one to be seen by its populace as worthy of the title. Perhaps the 2 most important traits a man needed was to be a native Babylonian, and honor the city and Marduk with his personal presence when ceremonies and rituals required, meaning that it was very difficult for a foreigner to claim the title. Also, back in 745 BC, Tiglath-Pileser's position was still precarious, and Assyria was just beginning to regain its strength. 732 BC, however, presented Tiglath-Pileser with his chance. That year was a turbulent one in Babylon. Its king, Nabu-Nadin-Ziri, was deposed and killed by a man called Nabu-Shuma-Ukin II, only to be deposed himself within weeks by a man called Nabu-Mukin-Ziri, who claimed, apparently successfully, the title of king. The problem with that? Well, Nabu Mukinziri was a Chaldean, from a tribe called Bait Amukani. So not only was he seen by Tiglath-Pileser as one who deposed his vassal, but a foreigner who was accepted by the Babylonians as their king? With peace achieved on all other fronts, and his empire stronger than ever, it was intervention time. In 731 BC, Tiglath-Pileser led the Assyrian army south. Nabu Mukinziri fled Babylon to his stronghold of Shapia, to the south of Babylon. Many of the Chaldean tribes quickly submitted, sending their tribute to the Assyrian king, while many others chose to resist, only to be taken out one by the Assyrians. Shapia held out against the Assyrian army, but its surrounding areas were devastated, and by the end of that year, it was all that remained with Nabu Mukinziri. If we are to believe the surviving inscriptions, more than 100,000 people from Chaldea were deported and resettled across the empire. 730 BC saw little military action, and was probably spent by Tiglath-Pileser improving his position and increasing his popularity in Babylon, especially amongst the city's priesthood and elites. In 729 BC, the great conqueror set out on what would turn out to be his last campaign. This time, Shapia fell to his forces, and Nabu Mukinziri and his son were both executed. With this final great victory against the Chaldean usurper, and with obviously no native Babylonian daring to challenge him for the throne, Tiglath-Pileser returned to Babylon, where he was crowned king of Babylon under the name of Pulo. Tiglath-Pileser now stood as master of all the lands between the Zagros Mountains and the Mediterranean. Assyria, under his wise and capable leadership, was now the greatest power on earth. Its mighty god Ashur feared and respected by all. Its brutal and battle-hardened army was the largest in the world by far at this point, and is still considered as one of the greatest in history. Urartu was humbled, the wealth from the rich coast of the eastern Mediterranean flowed into his coffers, Egypt was terrified, and any prince in the Near East that wasn't defeated in battle now came willingly to offer homage and tribute to Assyria. Most importantly, the crowns of the two great cities of Mesopotamia were united for the first time under a single ruler. In 727 BC, Tiglath-Pileser III died, and although the reign of his son Shalmaneser V didn't last, his empire endured, with more than 100 years of glory still lying ahead. This was in big part thanks to the foundations laid by Tiglath-Pileser III, who breathed life into an empire on the brink of destruction, and turned it, in less than 18 years, to the greatest power the world had ever seen. Thank you all for listening to the Conquest podcast. If you like the podcast, don't forget to rate it and press the subscribe button. Your reviews and comments are most welcome. You can leave them on a podcast's Facebook and Instagram pages called The Conquerors Podcast, a YouTube channel with the same name, or on iTunes or any platforms you guys use to listen. You can also contact me directly at theconquerorspodcast@gmail.com. Next episode, we travel to the lands of Nubia to cover two great conquerors who, sweeping out from the south, managed to turn the tables of history, and after centuries of being in the shadows of its ancient northern neighbor, led their kingdom to conquer the land of the Nile. They were the Nubian pharaohs. See you next time.